In the fall of 1848, while tearing down the abandoned St. Mary's Academy in Salem, Massachusetts, workers stumbled upon a hidden lead-lined box beneath the chapel floorboards. Inside were 47 journals, each belonging to a different girl, detailing horrific events that would forever haunt the town. The most shocking discovery was a list of names in the journals political elites from New England kept as detailed client records. The Massachusetts government immediately sealed the findings, citing public safety concerns, and to this day, the records remain classified. What follows comes from testimonies never meant to see the light of day, buried by powerful families, and the dying confession of a woman who carried these secrets for 60 years. If you seek the truth behind America's darkest secrets, this story is for you. But be warned, what happened at St. Mary's Academy challenges everything we know about power, virtue, and innocence in 19th century New England. Help me with a like and a subscribe to motivate me to make better videos, and don't forget to comment which country you are from. Salem in 1811 was trying to redeem its past after the infamous witch trials of 1692. The town's elites sought to restore their reputation, and when Victoria Fairfax arrived with impeccable credentials, her plan to open a girls' academy caught their attention. Victoria, born into wealth and educated in Philadelphia and London, was widowed at 32 and decided to dedicate her life to the moral development of young women. She opened St. Mary's Academy in Salem, offering free education to orphans and impoverished girls while also accepting paying students. The academy was housed in a mansion on Beacon Hill, which had a dark reputation after several families had fled, citing strange occurrences. Despite this, Victoria purchased the property and began renovations, adding a chapel and dormitories for 30 girls and private chambers for meditation. Victoria was joined by her sister Evangeline, a delicate but gifted musician and teacher, and her brother-in-law Bartholomew, a stern preacher who would become the Academy's chaplain. The Academy opened in September 1811 with much fanfare. Victoria's speech highlighted her mission to create a sanctuary where young women could develop intellectually and morally away from the world's corrupting influences. Among the first 23 students was 14-year-old Margaret Sullivan, an orphan with a sharp mind, and 15-year-old Priscilla Morse, who had lost both parents. The academy was meant to be a haven, but what truly occurred behind its walls would remain a dark mystery for generations to come. At 13, Hannah Whitmore was perhaps the most tragic of St. Mary's Academy's students. Her father had been jailed for theft, and her mother had disappeared, leaving only a note. Living in the poorhouse, Hannah's life was bleak, until Victoria Fairfax offered her a place at the academy. For the first time in months, Hannah's face brightened. She was promised a bed, regular meals, and an education. Along with her 20 classmates, Hannah entered St. Mary's, with hope, unaware that they were walking into a trap. The woman who promised to protect their virtue would soon steal their innocence, and the academy would become their prison. The first sign that something was wrong came from Mrs. Abigail Thornton, a seamstress who delivered linens to the academy. She noticed well-dressed gentlemen leaving the academy through a side entrance, trying to avoid being seen. They arrived after dark in expensive carriages, some nights as many as 6. Disturbingly, the students, once bright and hopeful, began to change. They became withdrawn, their eyes hollow, and some bore bruises that were quickly hidden. Margaret Sullivan, a spirited Irish girl, seemed to lose her life force, her once vibrant red hair now dull, her face gaunt and pale. On the night of December 13, 1812, Mrs. Thornton witnessed something that would haunt her. She saw strange flickering lights on the 3rd floor and heard muffled screams from the chapel. The screams were intermittent expressions of agony that sent chills down her spine. She strained to see inside, and what she glimpsed left her unsettled. The next morning, Mrs. Thornton learned that Hannah Whitmore had died suddenly of a fever. The funeral was a small private service attended only by faculty and students. Mrs. Thornton from a distance could hear the hymns being sung, but they were tinged with a strange desperation. Hannah was buried with no family present. She had none left. In the weeks following Hannah's death, Mrs. Thornton observed other students falling ill, moving slowly and speaking even less. She discreetly inquired about their health, but no one seemed willing to answer. The academy, once a place of hope, was transforming into a place of dread, and Mrs. Thornton's suspicions grew darker. Victoria Fairfax reassured Mrs. Thornton that the girls were simply struggling with the normal effects of rigorous academic study and moral discipline necessary for their spiritual growth. The girls, especially those from difficult backgrounds, needed time to adjust to the refined life Victoria provided. However, Mrs. Thornton's suspicions only deepened as she noticed a troubling pattern. The students most affected were the poorest, those without families to notice or resources to leave the academy. The wealthier students, though subdued, remained healthier and more alert. In February 1813, 2 more students died within a week. Priscilla Morse found dead in her bed, and Mary Catherine O'Brien, who died from brain fever after a brief illness. Both deaths were attributed to natural causes by Dr. Fairfax, the academy's physician, with no further investigation. Mrs. Thornton, though growing increasingly concerned, struggled with her lack of evidence. Who would believe a simple seamstress over the respected Victoria Fairfax, a pillar of the community? By spring 1813, a heavy silence hung over St. Mary's Academy. The deaths had cast a shadow over the institution, but the academy's routines continued as though they were mere interruptions. Victoria, instead of grieving, spoke with composure about spiritual trial, sacrifice, and obedience to authority. Her sermons to the girls became more intense, emphasizing the need for rigorous discipline to cleanse their souls. She told the students that their past lives of poverty and abandonment had marked them, and that only through extreme discipline could they find redemption. The surviving students had learned to hide their emotions, knowing that independent thinking or questioning the academy's practices would result in harsh punishment. Margaret Sullivan, once full of life, was now a shadow of her former self, silent, hollow-eyed, and moving through her daily routines like a ghost. She kept her thoughts carefully hidden, learning the art of emotional concealment. The academy, once a place of hope, had become a prison, where the girls were forced to suppress their every thought and feeling, all under the guise of moral and spiritual development. Margaret, despite her carefully constructed exterior, remained sharp and observant. She began noticing troubling patterns in the academy's routines. She observed that certain girls were selected for special instruction in the third-floor chambers after hours, often staying there well past midnight. These sessions, Margaret discovered, coincided with the arrival of mysterious gentlemen in unmarked carriages. These men always used the side entrance, which led directly to the third floor. Margaret also noted disturbing physical symptoms in the girls who attended these sessions: persistent headaches, tremors, and a general lack of appetite, which Dr. Edmund Fairfax attributed to spiritual sensitivity. The academy's rigid daily schedule left the girls exhausted and isolated, preventing them from forming any meaningful relationships. Any attempts at communication were harshly punished. Yet despite the oppressive structure, a subtle network of communication began to form among the students. Margaret, as one of the longest surviving students, became an unofficial leader of this underground system. Through it, she learned that the special instruction sessions were more than just religious education. The girls described strange, disorienting teas and ceremonies involving candles, incense, and prayers in unknown languages. The gentlemen who attended the sessions seemed detached but authoritative, making the students instinctively afraid. By the spring of 1813, Margaret realized the true nature of the academy. It wasn't a sanctuary of learning, but a place where young women's spirits and lives were systematically destroyed. She could feel herself slipping into the same condition as her deceased friends: persistent fatigue, trembling hands, and difficulty concentrating. But Margaret was determined not to surrender without a fight. As the season changed, she began formulating a desperate plan that would either secure her freedom or expose the truth about St. Mary's Academy. The opportunity Margaret had been waiting for arrived in the form of Miss Constance Hartwell, a new instructor hired in September 1813. Her arrival would become the catalyst for a series of events that Victoria Fairfax could never have anticipated. Miss Hartwell, tasked with teaching mathematics and natural philosophy, represented a significant departure from the Fairfax family's usual practices, and her presence would challenge the carefully constructed facade of the academy. Constance Hartwell, 24 years old and the daughter of a prosperous Boston merchant, had received an education that was both broad and rigorous. She had studied at Miss Willard's Female Seminary in Troy, New York, where critical thinking and open discussions were encouraged, a stark contrast to the controlled atmosphere of St. Mary's Academy. Constance had accepted the position at the academy for both practical and idealistic reasons. The salary was generous, and the chance to work with disadvantaged girls appealed to her strong sense of social responsibility despite her father's objections. Constance was determined to use teaching as a stepping stone, whether for a career or personal growth. From the moment she arrived at St. Mary's, Constance noticed inconsistencies. The students were intelligent but displayed a strange passivity when she asked questions to encourage discussion. They responded with blank stares or rote recitations which didn't seem to reflect genuine understanding. The girls appeared fearful of expressing opinions or asking questions, something Constance found unusual given her previous experience with young women who were naturally curious. She initially attributed it to the institution's strict religious discipline, but as the months passed, she began suspecting that something more sinister was at play. The first concrete sign of this came in October when Constance noticed Sarah Peaton, one of her brightest students, struggling with basic arithmetic. Sarah's hands trembled and she seemed unable to concentrate. When Constance gently inquired, Sarah whispered that her mind often felt cloudy, like there was a fog inside her head. Sarah explained that Dr. Fairfax had told her it was because her spirit was being purified, but Sarah remembered thinking more clearly before coming to the academy. This conversation set off alarm bells in Constance's mind, prompting her to observe her students more closely. Many exhibited symptoms of systemic poisoning: pale skin, listlessness, headaches, stomach ailments, and tremors. Constance's suspicions were further confirmed when she discovered that she was restricted from accessing certain areas of the academy, particularly the third floor. When she asked to use one of the rooms for private tutoring, Victoria Fairfax's response was swift and firm. Victoria explained that the third floor contained meditation chambers reserved for advanced spiritual instruction and must not be contaminated with secular activities. The uncomfortable firmness of Victoria's response made it clear that the third floor held secrets the Fairfax family wanted to protect. Constance's suspicions deepened as she carefully observed the academy's nighttime activities. One November evening, she followed Margaret Sullivan through the corridor, watching as the girl moved stealthily toward the side entrance, dressed in a glowing white gown instead of the academy's usual uniform. Margaret pressed her ear to the door, clearly listening to something on the other side before retracing her steps. When Margaret spotted Constance, the two froze, understanding that they had both been engaged in activities that could result in severe punishment if discovered. After a tense moment, Margaret stepped forward, asking Constance to stay after class the next day to discuss her findings. The following day, Margaret shared her shocking account with Constance. She described the special instruction sessions in detail, revealing that the girls were being systematically poisoned with substances that clouded their minds and weakened their bodies. Margaret explained the pattern of student deaths, the mysterious visitors who arrived at night, and her belief that the academy was not an educational institution, but something far more sinister. This revelation shattered Constance's assumptions about St. Mary's, and set both women on a desperate quest for evidence that could expose the Fairfax family's crimes. Margaret's voice was steady but filled with a quiet urgency as she revealed the horrifying truth. To Constance, St. Mary's Academy was not an educational institution, but a meticulously crafted operation to provide young women for the entertainment of powerful, wealthy men. The education and religious instruction were merely a facade to maintain the Academy's respectable reputation, while the real business took place on the third floor in secret. "They're not just killing us," Margaret concluded, her words chilling. "They're destroying us first, our minds, our will, our ability to resist. And when we're too weak to fight anymore, they use us until we die." Hannah, Priscilla, Mary Catherine, they didn't die of sickness. They were murdered. Constance, listening in growing horror, realized that Margaret's analysis fit together perfectly with everything she had observed. The tremors, the clouded minds, the strange visitors, everything pointed to a conspiracy of unimaginable evil. Yet even as she accepted the truth, Constance understood the difficulty of their situation. The Fairfax family was revered throughout Salem, with Victoria considered a pillar of Christian virtue, Evangeline beloved for her musical talents, and Bartholomew admired as a powerful preacher. Any accusations coming from a seamstress and a charity student would be dismissed as slander or madness. They needed concrete, undeniable proof, but obtaining it without alerting the Fairfax family to their suspicions was a monumental challenge, one that could cost them their lives. As winter settled over Salem, Constance and Margaret began their dangerous quest for evidence, all while becoming the prey in a deadly game. Their enemies, with vast resources, connections, and ruthlessness, were closing in. The winter of 1813 to 1814 transformed St. Mary's Academy into a battleground where two desperate women fought for survival and truth. They used their contrasting backgrounds, Constance's education and Margaret's street-smart survival instincts, to form a sophisticated intelligence operation. Constance's legitimate access to administrative areas gave them their first breakthrough. She began examining Victoria's office files during her allotted time, aided by Margaret's skill at picking locks, learned during her harsh childhood. What they discovered exceeded their worst fears: detailed ledgers not of academic records, but of financial transactions and coded evaluations of the students. Each girl was treated as inventory, with progress monitored through conditioning rather than academic achievement. Margaret's entry subject 12 described her as progressing slowly, with a moderate but consistent client interest, indicating the clinical detachment with which the girls were managed. The ledgers detailed client preferences for specific physical characteristics and temperaments, revealing the Academy's role in catering to the depraved desires of wealthy men. The most damning discovery was a letter from Victoria to a client discussing a girl's progress and the payment for her services. "Your usual contribution of $200 will be most gratefully received." The letter concluded, making it clear that the Academy was a procurement center for the most vile exploitation. As they uncovered more documents, the full extent of the operation became apparent. The Academy systematically broke down the girls through drugs, psychological manipulation, and physical abuse until they became compliant victims sold to the highest bidder. Those who resisted or became too ill to be useful were eliminated with overdoses of laudanum and other substances. The deaths of students like Hannah Priscilla and Mary Catherine were not accidents. They were part of the business model. The Academy was a carefully orchestrated nightmare, and Constance and Margaret were now its most dangerous threats. Clothing for a dark flowing gown that seemed to absorb the light around her, her steel gray eyes cold and calculating as she surveyed the room. As she took her place at the front of the chamber, the hush that fell over the gathering was palpable. The air was thick with tension, and Constance, hidden in the storage closet, could feel the weight of it pressing down on her chest. Through the small ventilation grate she watched as Evangeline placed the cups on a table in the center of the room, her hands trembling slightly as she moved, though her face remained serene. The door to the chamber opened once more, and several men entered, wealthy, well-dressed, and carrying an air of both anticipation and detachment. They took their seats around the table, speaking in low voices, their attention divided between the proceedings and the girls who had been lined up on the far side of the room. The girls, Margaret among them, stood in white gowns, looking pale and subdued, as if their spirits had already been drained. Their eyes were glazed, their bodies stiff, and Constance could see the subtle tremors in their hands. Victoria spoke first, her voice commanding yet strangely soft. She welcomed the guests with an air of practiced grace, introducing the girls one by one, though her words lacked any true warmth. As each girl was presented, Constance noted the way the men observed them too closely, as if they were inspecting cattle. There was a distinct air of ownership in their gaze. Margaret stood among them, her body rigid, but her eyes scanning the room, trying to remain as alert as she could. Constance could see the struggle within her, the battle between the fog that clouded her mind and the part of her that was determined to survive. Constance's heart pounded in her chest as she watched, feeling her own pulse quicken in time with the unsettling events unfolding before her. She could sense the danger, the palpable threat of what was about to transpire, but she remained silent, every muscle in her body tensed, knowing she had to gather the evidence they needed. At Victoria's signal, the lights dimmed further, and the room was filled with the sound of soft chanting in a language Constance did not recognize. The ritual began, an eerie and disturbing blend of ceremony and control, with the men participating passively as though they were all part of some grotesque theater. The girls, still standing, were given tea, their bodies swaying slightly as they drank. Margaret, despite the drugged haze she was slipping into, kept her gaze fixed on the proceedings, trying to memorize every detail, every movement. Constance could hardly breathe as the scene played out. The men murmured their approval, their eyes scanning the girls with an unsettling mix of desire and ownership. At that moment, Constance knew with grim certainty that the lives of these girls were nothing more than a commodity to be bought, sold, and discarded at the whims of men who saw them as nothing but tools for their pleasure. The next part of the ritual was even more disturbing. The men stood and moved toward the girls, who had been positioned in a way that forced them into submission. Constance, in her hidden vantage point, felt a wave of nausea wash over her as she saw the cruelty in the men's eyes. Her heart ached for the girls, Margaret especially, and for all the young lives that had been destroyed by this monstrous institution. But Constance also felt a flicker of hope. They had the evidence now, the undeniable proof of the crimes being committed at St. Mary's Academy. With Margaret's testimony and the records they had uncovered, there was no turning back. They had to expose the truth, no matter the cost. The Fairfax family's carefully constructed facade of respectability was beginning to crumble, and with it, the foundation of their twisted empire. As the ritual came to a close, the men began to depart, their expressions satisfied and empty, leaving behind the broken and drugged girls. Constance waited until the chamber had emptied, the air still thick with the remnants of incense and tension. She knew it was time to leave, but the weight of what she had witnessed would stay with her forever. Margaret was waiting for her, her face pale but determined, as they silently acknowledged the dangerous path they had just set foot upon. They had seen the truth, and now they would fight to ensure that the Fairfax family's crimes were exposed, no matter the cost. Constance's heart raced as she read the note, the elegant handwriting on the paper, feeling like a personal invitation to her doom. The morning light felt oppressive, and as she made her way to Victoria's office after chapel, every step seemed to echo in the empty halls. The weight of what she had witnessed in the chamber the previous evening, the ritual, the exploitation, the sinister precision with which it had been orchestrated haunted her every thought. The memory of the chamber, transformed into a nightmarish parody of a church sanctuary, still lingered. The deep purple silk gown that Victoria had worn, adorned with symbols Constance didn't recognize, seemed to pulse with malevolent energy in the flickering lamplight. The candles, the tapestries depicting horrific scenes, and the raised platform where the girls were forced to stand, everything about that room had been designed to strip away their humanity. The students, drugged and manipulated, moved with a dreamlike quality, their suffering interpreted by the men as part of some twisted spiritual ritual, all orchestrated by the Fairfax family. Constance had watched in horror as 6 men arrived through the side entrance, prominent figures from Salem and beyond, accustomed to getting what they wanted, no matter the cost. The special instruction session revealed itself as an elaborate ritual where the students were treated as sacred objects, manipulated and violated under the guise of spiritual purification. The ritual's execution had been chillingly precise, directed by Bartholomew Fairfax and accompanied by Evangeline's haunting music. Victoria, ever the orchestrator, ensured the client's preferences were satisfied while maintaining the illusion of religious significance. When the session finally ended, Constance remained hidden in the closet for hours, shaken beyond words. She had the evidence now, but what she had witnessed left her with a sinking realization. The scope of the Fairfax operation was far beyond anything they could challenge. The network of powerful men involved judges, legislators, merchants, and clergy would ensure that any attempt to expose the truth would be crushed. Even if they escaped and reached the authorities, they would be up against some of the most respected men in New England, whose influence could discredit them entirely. As Constance returned to her room in the early morning hours, the weight of the decision ahead pressed on her. She and Margaret could either remain silent, guaranteeing their own deaths, or attempt to expose the truth, knowing it would almost certainly lead to their destruction. But they also knew that if they didn't act, countless other girls would continue to suffer and die. The risk was unimaginable, but they had no choice. Then on February 14th, 1814, everything changed. Constance woke to find a note slipped under her door, written in Victoria's familiar hand. "Miss Hartwell, please join me in my office immediately after morning chapel. We have urgent matters to discuss regarding your future." The words seemed innocent enough, but Constance knew that they marked the beginning of the end. The facade was slipping, and Victoria had finally realized that her secrets were no longer safe. ChatGPT said, "Broken, but I wasn't. I knew it was the only way to turn the tables." Margaret's voice was low but resolute, and Constance felt a surge of both relief and admiration for the girl who had risked so much to bring them all to this moment. As the constables moved to arrest the Fairfax family, Victoria's usual commanding presence crumbled her face, twisting in disbelief. "This is preposterous," she shrieked, her voice filled with panic. "These officers have no authority here. This is a private educational institution operating under proper charter from the Commonwealth." But the constable stood firm, undeterred by her protests. "Ma'am, we have sworn testimony from multiple witnesses, documentary evidence of criminal conspiracy, and eyewitness accounts of crimes committed on these premises. You will come with us now peacefully, or we will use whatever force is necessary to compel your compliance." Victoria's entire demeanor shifted as the weight of the situation bore down on her. The carefully constructed facade of respectability built on the backs of countless innocent girls was finally beginning to fall apart. Her control over the academy and the lives of the girls within it was crumbling before her eyes. The last of her power and influence seemed to slip away as the constables handcuffed her, Bartholomew and Evangeline, while the 2 rough men who had supported them were also taken into custody. As the Fairfax family members were escorted out of the room, Margaret walked over to Constance, her green eyes blazing with determination. "I'm sorry I couldn't tell you," she whispered urgently. "When they confronted me 2 days ago, I realized it was our only chance. They thought I was broken, but I wasn't. I knew it was the only way to turn the tables." Constance's heart swelled with gratitude and a deep sense of respect for Margaret's bravery. She had known that something was off, that Margaret was still holding on to a flicker of hope, even when it seemed all was lost. Now that hope had ignited into something much stronger, the chance to dismantle the Fairfax family's empire of cruelty and expose the truth. As the officers escorted the Fairfax family away, Constance couldn't help but feel a mixture of triumph and disbelief. The nightmare that had gripped St. Mary's Academy was finally unraveling, and the secrets that had been buried for so long were coming to light. The girls who had been trapped in that hellish institution would finally have their voices heard. The victims would no longer be silenced. Margaret stood beside Constance, her expression weary but resolute. The battle had been long, but they had won. And as the sounds of the constable's footsteps faded into the distance, Constance knew that this was only the beginning of the long process of justice and healing that would follow. Together they had brought down the very heart of the Fairfax family's darkness, and in doing so, they had given the Academy's victims a fighting chance at freedom. Margaret's bravery in exposing the crimes at St. Mary's Academy had been nothing short of astounding. When she was confronted by Bartholomew, she had confessed everything, but her cooperation was merely a facade. She convinced him that her fear of punishment made her willing to do anything, including betraying Constance and herself. This lie had given her the chance to gain access to areas of the Academy normally forbidden to students, including the side entrance that led to the outside world. Under the assumption that she was securely drugged, Margaret had slipped away in the early morning hours and gone to the Salem Constabulary Station. Her account of the atrocities at St. Mary's Academy initially met with skepticism, but the authorities quickly became convinced after Margaret provided detailed knowledge of names, dates, and financial transactions. She also provided a list of prominent clients scheduled to visit the Academy that evening, including judges and legislators who could not escape exposure if caught in the act of exploiting drugged children. This revelation galvanized the authorities, overcoming their usual reluctance to challenge the influential men who patronized the Academy. As the Fairfax family was arrested, the well-maintained empire of exploitation that they had built began to fall apart swiftly. In a matter of hours, Dr. Edmund Fairfax was arrested at his private practice, and officers moved to secure the Academy's records interviewing the surviving students. The network of powerful men who had patronized the Academy found themselves facing ruin as their names appeared in the seized documents. Even Mrs. Abigail Thornton, the seamstress, whose suspicions had been dismissed for years, became a key witness, having kept detailed records of the mysterious visitors and the gradual deterioration of the students over the course of her deliveries. The trial of the Fairfax family became one of the most sensational in Massachusetts history, revealing a corruption that reached into the highest echelons of New England society. The authorities discovered that 43 young women had died at the Academy not from natural causes, but from systematic poisoning to eliminate witnesses and dispose of victims who had become too damaged to be profitable. The trial began in September of 1814 and lasted 7 weeks, drawing national attention and even coverage from European publications. Victoria Fairfax, despite the overwhelming evidence, tried to portray herself as a victim of circumstances manipulated by her male relatives and clients. However, the testimony of survivors and her own meticulous records revealed her true role in orchestrating the Academy's operations. Bartholomew Fairfax attempted to defend himself by claiming that his religious ceremonies had been misunderstood, but his defense collapsed when investigators discovered that the rituals were invented to provide psychological cover for sexual exploitation. Evangeline Fairfax tragically had been drugged for over a decade, rendering her mentally incompetent and an unwitting accomplice. The network of influential clients, including judges and legislators, faced varying degrees of consequence. While some managed to avoid prosecution, others were forced to resign or saw their careers destroyed. Dr. Edmund Fairfax was sentenced to 20 years in prison, which effectively ended the medical careers of several other physicians who had been involved in similar schemes. Victoria and Bartholomew Fairfax were sentenced to death by hanging, marking a significant moment in Massachusetts history. Victoria became the first woman executed in the state for crimes other than witchcraft. The execution was carried out on November 15, 1814, in front of over 2,000 spectators who had come to witness the end of what was described as one of the most depraved criminal conspiracies in American history. Margaret Sullivan's courage in exposing the crimes made her a national hero, and she used her newfound fame to advocate for the protection of orphaned and impoverished children. She established her own educational institution in Boston, providing free schooling for disadvantaged girls. Her academy operated successfully for over 30 years, educating hundreds of young women who became teachers, nurses, and activists. Constance Hartwell, also profoundly impacted by the trial, returned to Boston and married a fellow teacher. Together, they founded a progressive school focused on critical thinking and independent inquiry rather than rote memorization. Constance spent the remainder of her life working to ensure that educational institutions would be subject to regular oversight, preventing the kind of abuse that had flourished at St. Mary's Academy. The academy building itself was demolished in 1815, and the material was sold to compensate the families of the victims. The site remained vacant for over 20 years before being developed into a public park, a fitting end to an institution that had caused so much suffering and destruction. This dark chapter in American history serves as a stark reminder of the dangers of unchecked power and the lengths to which those in positions of authority will go to protect their secrets. The story of St. Mary's Academy is one of manipulation, exploitation, and systemic abuse, hidden beneath the veil of respectability and religious authority. The courage of individuals like Margaret Sullivan and Constance Hartwell, who risked everything to expose the truth, demonstrates that even in the face of seemingly insurmountable power, justice can prevail. The reforms that followed the scandal, regular inspections of educational institutions, the requirement for detailed record-keeping, and a stronger system of oversight have helped shape the modern educational landscape, ensuring that institutions can no longer operate with impunity. However, the legacy of the St. Mary's Academy scandal goes beyond these legislative changes. It establishes the precedent that no one, regardless of wealth status or religious authority, is above the law when credible evidence is presented. The conviction of the Fairfax family and their powerful clients showed that American justice could hold even the most influential members of society accountable. Margaret Sullivan's words during the trial remain as relevant today as they were then. They thought we were powerless because we were poor, because we were young, because we were alone. They thought they could use us and discard us without consequence because no one would believe our word against theirs. But they forgot that even the powerless can find power when they stand together for truth. This sentiment is a powerful reminder of the need for vigilance and the courage to speak out against injustice, no matter how deeply entrenched it may seem. While the world has changed in many ways since the events at St. Mary's, the fundamental challenges of protecting the vulnerable from exploitation and ensuring that institutions serve their true purpose remain. We are still grappling with the same issues of power, corruption, and accountability. The story of the girls who died at St. Mary's is not just a historical tale, it's a cautionary one, reminding us that the price of allowing evil to flourish is always too high. Their voices may have been silenced by their tormentors, but through the testimony of survivors and the records of their suffering, their legacy lives on. As you reflect on this chapter in history, ask yourself, could such systematic exploitation happen again today, under the guise of respectability and religious authority? How can we ensure that we are vigilant in protecting those who are vulnerable and holding institutions accountable? The story of St. Mary's Academy teaches us that we must never forget the lessons of the past, for in doing so, we honor the victims and reaffirm our commitment to truth and justice. Thank you everyone for watching the video. Remember to like and subscribe to the channel to watch the next interesting videos.